Well, well, what do we have here?
Richard Blackstone's voice sliced through the Plaza Hotel's refined atmosphere. He stared at 12-year-old Damon like examining a bug. Did someone's help bring their little pet to work? The tech billionaire grabbed a champagne flute from a passing tray and poured it slowly onto the marble floor. The golden liquid spread in a puddle at Damon's feet. Oops, Richard smirked. Maybe Mommy can clean that up later. He pulled out his wallet, peeled off a 20, and threw it into the wet mess. There's your tip. 300 millionaires watched in stunned silence. Phones emerged like vultures sensing prey. Richard's voice boomed across the ballroom. Tell you what, kid, your mother says you play music. Prove you're worth the air you're breathing. He pointed at the battered saxophone case. Play the sax, and I'll adopt you. Damon stood frozen in the puddle, humiliation burning his cheeks crimson. Have you ever watched a monster disguised in a tuxedo? What happened next ended his reign of terror forever. The humiliation hung in the air like smoke. But to understand why this moment would shatter more than just a 12-year-old's pride, you need to know who Damon Williams really was, and more importantly, who he could become. 3 hours earlier, Damon had pressed his face against the cold window of the Queens-bound subway. The city blurred past in streaks of light and shadow. His saxophone case sat heavy across his lap, not just an instrument, but a lifeline to dreams that seemed impossibly far away. The apartment he called home was a one-bedroom box on the 4th floor of a building that had seen better decades. Paint peeled from walls like old scabs. The radiator clanged through winter nights, providing more noise than warmth. Cockroaches scattered when lights flickered on. The hallway reeked of fried food and broken promises. But in the corner, near the window that faced the fire escape, sat something precious. A small music stand his mother had bought from a pawn shop for $15. Its metal legs were bent, its surface scratched, but it held sheet music like an altar holds prayers. This was where Damon practiced. Every day after school, while other kids played video games or hung out at corner stores, he climbed onto the fire escape with his father's saxophone. The metal grating was cold against his knees, but it was the only place he could play without angry neighbors pounding on thin walls. Mrs. Carter from 4B had complained about the noise. Mr. Rodriguez had threatened to call the super. Even the building's elderly superintendent had shuffled up 4 flights of stairs to deliver the landlord's warning, keep that racket down or find somewhere else to live. So Damon played in the cold, in the rain, in snow that made his fingers numb and his breath visible in small clouds. He played because music was the only language that made sense of his father's absence. He played because every note brought him closer to understanding who Marcus Williams had been. The saxophone itself told a story of sacrifice and hope. Dents marked its brass surface, battle scars from tours in Afghanistan, where Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams had carried it through desert bases and forward operating posts. When other soldiers cleaned weapons, Marcus played jazz standards under star-filled skies, his music a reminder that beauty could survive even in the darkest places. Marcus never came home. An IED on a supply route outside Kandahar ended the music on a Tuesday morning when Damon was 5 years old. The Air Force Honor Guard had folded an American flag with military precision, but they'd also handed Carmen something else. Her husband's saxophone case, worn and weathered, containing an instrument that still held echoes of love songs and lullabies. Your daddy believed music could build bridges where words failed, Carmen told Damon on his 6th birthday, placing the saxophone in his small hands for the first time. Maybe you'll play those bridges too. 7 years later, Damon had built bridges to places his mother couldn't even imagine. His fingers moved across the keys with intuitive grace, finding melodies that seemed to flow from some deep well of understanding. His school music teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had pulled Carmen aside after parent conferences with urgency in her voice. "Your son has something special," she'd whispered, glancing around to make sure no other parents were listening. "Real special. But he needs proper training, private lessons. Maybe even She paused, as if afraid to voice the dream. Juilliard has a pre-college program. The word hung between them like a beautiful impossibility. Juilliard, where Marcus had dreamed of studying before life took him in different directions, where Carmen herself had once been accepted, before her mother's cancer diagnosis forced her to choose between her future and her family. 20 years ago, Carmen Williams had been Carmen Rodriguez, a piano prodigy from the Bronx whose fingers could make keys weep and soar. She'd practiced 8 hours a day, won every competition she entered, earned a full scholarship to study classical performance at the world's most prestigious conservatory. Then the phone call came. Ovarian cancer. Stage 4. Her mother had 6 months to live. Carmen folded the Juilliard acceptance letter and put it in a drawer. She took a job at a nursing home, spending her days helping her mother eat, walk, remember who she was. The piano lessons stopped. The competitions ended. Her fingers grew stiff from disuse while her dreams slowly suffocated. Her mother lived 3 years longer than doctors predicted. Long enough to see Carmen marry Marcus, a jazz-loving soldier with kind eyes and calloused hands. Long enough to hold baby Damon before cancer finally claimed its victory. Now Carmen worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. Mornings at a diner in Astoria, slinging eggs and coffee for construction workers who left dollar tips on $20 checks. Afternoons cleaning office buildings in Manhattan, invisible to executives who stepped around her mop bucket without acknowledgement. Evenings like this one, serving champagne to people who spent more on wine than she made in a month. The Plaza Hotel gig was supposed to be different. Premium catering, better tips, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to network with people who could open doors for Damon. Carmen had practiced conversations in the mirror, rehearsing how she might casually mention her son's talent to the right person at the right moment. Instead, her babysitter had canceled 2 hours before her shift. Carmen faced an impossible choice. Lose the job that paid her highest hourly rate, or bring Damon along and pray he'd stay invisible in the corner. She'd chosen hope over caution, a decision that would change everything. The weight of their situation pressed down like winter air. Rent was due in 6 days. Carmen had $847 in her checking account. The rent was down $200. The electricity bill sat unopened on their kitchen table because some truths were too heavy to face before absolutely necessary. Worse yet, Damon's school had announced budget cuts. The music program, his only connection to formal training, would be eliminated after Christmas break. No more instruments. No more Mrs. Rodriguez encouraging him to reach higher. No more school concerts where his saxophone could sing to audiences who actually listened. Tonight represented their last real shot. If Carmen could connect with the right person, if someone could hear Damon play, if a miracle could punch through the wall of indifference that separated their world from the world of opportunity. But miracles, Carmen had learned, usually came disguised as disasters. And disasters, she was about to discover, sometimes wore expensive tuxedos and cruel smiles. In that corner of the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom, Damon Williams stood with champagne dripping from his worn shoes, his father's saxophone case clutched against his chest like armor. He didn't know that everything was about to change. He didn't know that the man mocking him was about to become the instrument of his own transformation. All Damon knew was that his face burned with shame, and 300 strangers were staring at him like he was an exhibit in a zoo. Richard Blackstone didn't just enter rooms. He conquered them. Tonight was no different. The billionaire had arrived at the Plaza Hotel in a motorcade that cost more than most people's annual salaries. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows. Personal security detail. The kind of entrance that made valets straighten their ties and doormen hold their breath. At 52, Richard commanded attention through the sheer gravitational pull of wealth. His net worth had crossed $4 billion last quarter, built on facial recognition software that governments and corporations paid astronomical fees to access. His AI algorithms could identify anyone, anywhere, from any camera feed. Privacy, he often joked to investors, was a luxury the modern world couldn't afford. The Armani tuxedo he wore tonight cost $18,000, custom-tailored in Milan, flown to New York on his private jet. His Patek Philippe watch contained more platinum than some small country's entire reserves. Even his cufflinks were a statement, carved from meteorite fragments because earthly materials apparently weren't exclusive enough. But the real power wasn't in what he wore. It was in how he moved through the plaza's grand ballroom like he owned every marble tile, every crystal chandelier, every person breathing the same air. "Richard!" A venture capitalist rushed over, champagne sloshing in his eagerness. "Magnificent donation tonight. 50 million. Truly generous." Richard barely glanced at him. "Tax write-off," he said, already scanning the room for more important conversations. The man's face fell, but Richard had already moved on. This was his pattern. Acknowledge people based on their usefulness. Discard them when they served no purpose. The ballroom was full of admirers who mistook his wealth for wisdom, his success for virtue. His entourage followed at a respectful distance. Vivian, his trophy wife of 8 years, glided beside him in a dress that cost more than a new car. She was beautiful in the calculated way of someone who'd had every flaw surgically corrected. But tonight, something seemed different. The smile felt forced. Her laugh came a beat too late. Behind them trailed Marcus Carter, his personal assistant, a Harvard MBA who'd sold his soul for proximity to power. Marcus carried Richard's phone, his schedule, his secrets. He fielded calls from senators and tech CEOs while Richard sampled caviar and dismissed charities with casual cruelty. 2 bodyguards completed the procession. Former special forces, they looked like they could break bones with their pinkies. Their job wasn't just protection, it was intimidation, a reminder that Richard Blackstone was untouchable. "The quarterly projections look exceptional," Marcus whispered, holding up the phone screen. "Stock prices, acquisition targets, profit margins, the numbers that governed Richard's universe." "Of course they do," Richard replied, not bothering to look. "When you own the game, you don't worry about the score." This wasn't arrogance. This was a fact. Richard's companies had transformed entire industries. His software powered airport security, border control, and police surveillance. He knew things about people that they didn't know about themselves. Their faces, their movements, their digital footprints, everything was data to be collected, analyzed, monetized. But his greatest power wasn't technological. It was psychological. Richard had perfected the art of making people feel small. A dismissive glance could end careers. A cruel comment could destroy reputations. Tonight, he was hunting for entertainment, and the staff provided perfect targets. He snapped his fingers at a passing waiter, a young man barely out of college, probably drowning in student loans. The waiter hurried over, trying to hide his nervousness. "These appetizers are cold," Richard announced loudly, though he hadn't touched the tray. "What kind of establishment serves cold food to paying guests?" "I'm sorry, sir. I can get you fresh. Don't apologize. Fix it." Richard's voice carried across nearby conversations. Other guests turned to watch the spectacle. "And next time, pay attention to details. That's what separates professionals from—" He gestured dismissively. "Whatever this is." The waiter's face flushed red, but he nodded and hurried away. Richard smiled, satisfied with his demonstration of dominance. Vivian touched his arm gently. "That was unnecessary, Richard." "Was it?" He looked at her with the same cold calculation he used on everyone else. The boy learned a valuable lesson about excellence. Consider it charity. But Vivian didn't laugh. Instead, she stepped slightly away, creating distance that felt more than physical. Richard didn't notice. His attention had shifted to something far more interesting across the ballroom. In the corner, near the silent auction tables, he'd spotted movement that didn't belong. A woman in a server's uniform, clearly uncomfortable in this environment. And next to her, a child. A black child with a beat-up case that probably contained some pathetic musical instrument. They looked so out of place, so obviously inferior to everyone else in the room. Richard's eyes gleamed with predatory interest. The evening had just become significantly more entertaining. He began moving toward them, his entourage following like sharks, sensing blood in the water. Other guests noticed the shift in his attention and started turning to see what had captured the great Richard Blackstone's interest. Tonight's charity auction was about to become something else entirely. A demonstration of power. A lesson in knowing one's place in the natural order of things. Richard Blackstone was about to remind everyone why he was untouchable. The moment arrived like a predator finally pouncing on wounded prey. Richard Blackstone had been circling for 10 minutes, watching Carmen refill champagne glasses with the mechanical precision of someone trying to remain invisible. He'd observed how she avoided eye contact with guests, how she positioned herself near walls and corners, how she kept glancing nervously at her son. Damon sat hunched in a chair near the silent auction tables, his father's saxophone case balanced across his knees like a shield. The boy had been perfectly still for nearly an hour, understanding instinctively that movement would draw unwanted attention. But Richard Blackstone lived for unwanted attention. "Ladies and gentlemen!" His voice boomed across the grand ballroom like a dinner bell. 300 conversations stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. The string quartet in the corner actually missed a note. All eyes turned toward the tech billionaire standing in the center of the marble floor, his arms spread wide like a ringmaster about to announce the main event. "It appears we have a very special guest with us tonight." Richard's smile was the kind sharks wore before feeding. "A young musician who's crashed our little gathering." Carmen's blood turned to ice water. The champagne bottle in her hands trembled so violently she had to set it down before she dropped it. Across the ballroom, her supervisor, a stern woman named Patricia, who'd already warned her about inappropriate distractions, was glaring with murderous intensity. Damon tried to make himself smaller in his chair, but 300 pairs of eyes were already locked on him like spotlights. Phones emerged from purses and jacket pockets. The digital vultures were circling. "Now, I'm a generous man," Richard continued, his voice dripping with false benevolence. "I believe in giving everyone a chance to prove their worth. Even—" He gestured toward Damon with theatrical flourish. "Uninvited guests." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the cruelty underneath Richard's words. Others leaned forward eagerly, hungry for the spectacle they sensed was coming. Margaret Carter, the New York Philharmonic's principal violinist, frowned from her position near the auction tables. She'd been watching the boy for the past hour, noting how carefully he handled his instrument case, how his fingers occasionally tapped silent rhythms against his leg. Something about him felt different, familiar. But Richard wasn't interested in subtlety or observation. He was interested in domination. "That case you're clutching, son." The word son dripped with condescension. "I'm assuming it contains some kind of musical instrument, am I right?" Damon nodded slightly, his throat too tight for words. "Excellent!" Richard clapped his hands together. "Now here's what we're going to do. You're going to stand up, walk to the center of this beautiful room, and show all these nice people what you can do with that." He squinted at the battered case. "Whatever it is you've got in there." The silence in the ballroom was suffocating. Carmen took a step forward, her maternal instincts overriding her terror. But Damon caught her eye and shook his head slightly. He wouldn't let his mother sacrifice her job to protect him. "But here's the thing," Richard continued, his voice growing louder, more theatrical. "I'm not just asking you to play. I'm offering you a deal, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." He reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. Italian leather, probably worth more than Carmen's monthly salary. With deliberate slowness, he counted out several $100 bills. "Play something that actually impresses me," Really impresses me, and I'll pay for your music lessons for an entire year." The money fluttered in his fingers like bait on a hook. Private lessons with the best teachers money can buy. The crowd murmured appreciatively. To them, this sounded like generosity, like a fairy tale opportunity for a deserving child. But Richard wasn't finished. "However," his smile turned predatory, "if you embarrass yourself up there, if you prove that you're just another kid with delusions of talent, well," he shrugged with calculated indifference, "at least you'll have a good story about the time you tried to play with the big boys." The cruelty was masterful in its subtlety. To most observers, Richard appeared to be offering a golden opportunity. But Damon understood the true nature of the trap. This wasn't about music or generosity. This was about public humiliation disguised as charity. Patricia, Carmen's supervisor, was frantically signaling for her to intervene, to remove her son before this spectacle could continue. Other staff members had stopped working entirely, drawn into the drama unfolding in their workplace. "Come on now," Richard's voice took on a taunting edge. "Don't keep us waiting. Your mother works very hard to get you into fancy places like this. Surely you don't want to waste such a generous opportunity." The word generous was a blade wrapped in velvet. Every person in that ballroom understood the subtext. This boy didn't belong here. His mother was a charity herself, and now her son would provide entertainment for his betters. Damon's hands shook as he looked down at his father's saxophone case. The worn leather, the military surplus straps, the dents and scratches that told stories of love and loss and dreams deferred. 300 strangers waited for his answer. 300 phones ready to capture whatever came next. 300 witnesses to what Richard Blackstone assumed would be a lesson in knowing one's place. The question hung in the air like a noose. Do you dare? The silence stretched like a held breath. 300 faces stared at Damon, waiting for him to crumble under the weight of their expectations, waiting for him to run, waiting for him to prove Richard Blackstone right. But something was happening inside the 12-year-old boy that none of them could see. Damon's fingers traced the worn brass latches of his father's saxophone case. Each scratch told a story. Each dent carried a memory. He could almost hear his father's voice through the years, through the distance between worlds. "Music doesn't care about your circumstances, son. It only cares about your heart." Carmen watched her boy from across the ballroom, her own heart breaking with every second of his humiliation. She wanted to rush over, to shield him, to tell these cruel strangers that her son was worth more than all their money combined. But Damon's eyes met hers across the crowd, and in that look, she saw something that stopped her cold. Recognition. This was his moment, not hers to save him from, but his to claim. Damon remembered the fire escape, the cold metal grating against his knees, the way his breath formed clouds in winter air while he played for an audience of pigeons and city lights. He remembered Mrs. Rodriguez pulling him aside after class, her voice hushed with excitement. "You have something special, Damon. Something that can't be taught or bought." He remembered his mother's stories about his father, how Marcus Williams had played jazz in Afghan forward operating bases, how his music had given homesick soldiers a few minutes of peace in a war zone, how he'd believed that beauty could survive anywhere, even in the ugliest places. This ballroom, with its crystal chandeliers and designer gowns and cruel laughter, was just another kind of war zone. And Damon Williams was his father's son. He stood up slowly, the saxophone case heavy in his small hands. His legs felt unsteady, but his resolve was growing stronger with each heartbeat. The crowd sensed movement and leaned forward like predators scenting weakness. But Damon wasn't weak. Not anymore. He walked toward the center of the ballroom, each step more confident than the last. The marble floor stretched before him like a stage, like a battlefield, like a place where dreams either died or were born. When he reached the space Richard had indicated, Damon set his case down carefully. His hands no longer shook as he worked the latches. The brass gleamed dully in the chandelier light as he lifted out his father's saxophone. He looked up at Richard Blackstone, this man who thought money made him powerful, who believed cruelty made him strong. And then Damon spoke, his voice quiet but carrying across the silent ballroom like a prayer. "I'd like to play something for my father." Damon's hands trembled as he assembled his father's alto saxophone. The instrument showed every year of its service, brass tarnished to a warm gold, dents from overseas deployment mapping its history like battle scars. When he attached the mouthpiece and neck, the familiar weight settled into his arms like coming home. The Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom had never hosted anything like this. 300 of Manhattan's elite stood frozen in a tableau of expectation and cruelty, their phones raised like weapons, their breath collectively held. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors that had witnessed countless galas, but nothing that would matter as much as what was about to unfold. Richard Blackstone stood 20 feet away, arms crossed, that predatory smile still playing at his lips. He'd positioned himself for the best view of what he assumed would be spectacular failure. His wife, Vivian, had stepped back, distancing herself from the cruelty she could no longer stomach. Even his bodyguards seemed uncomfortable with the theater their boss had orchestrated. Carmen pressed herself against a marble pillar, her server's uniform marking her as invisible to most guests, but her eyes burning with a mother's fierce love and terror. Patricia, her supervisor, was making cutting gestures across her throat, universal sign language for, "End this now before it gets worse." But it was too late for endings. This was the beginning of something none of them had seen coming. Damon brought the saxophone to his lips and played a single tentative note. The sound emerged soft and uncertain, barely audible above the ambient noise of shifting feet and suppressed whispers. Some guests exchanged glances, their assumptions about what came next seeming confirmed. Richard chuckled quietly to himself. This was going exactly as planned. The kid would stumble through a few painful notes, the crowd would get their entertainment, and everyone would remember their place in the natural order of things. Then Damon played another note. Stronger this time. Clearer. And then he spoke, his young voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "This is Strange Fruit." The title hit the crowd like a physical blow. Not a crowd-pleasing jazz standard or a safe classical piece, but Billie Holiday's haunting anthem about racial injustice. A song that carried the weight of American history in every note, the pain of generations in every phrase. The choice was audacious, dangerous, perfect. Margaret Carter, the principal violinist who'd been watching from the auction tables, straightened in recognition. She knew this song. She knew its power. She knew the technical demands it placed on even experienced musicians. And she knew that choosing to perform it here, in this moment, took a kind of courage that most adults never possessed. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the light entertainment they'd expected. This was something else entirely. Something that would force them to confront truths they preferred to avoid. The opening notes emerged from Damon's saxophone like a prayer whispered in a cathedral. Soft, reverent. But underneath the gentleness was something else, a strength that seemed impossible from such a small frame. His fingers found their positions with practiced ease, muscle memory guiding him through the opening phrase. Richard's smirk began to falter. This wasn't what he'd expected. The kid was actually playing, really playing. Not the amateur squawking he'd anticipated, but something that sounded almost professional. As Damon moved into the song's haunting melody, the transformation began. His breathing steadied, drawing from techniques he'd learned through countless hours of practice on cold fire escapes. His posture straightened, shoulders back, spine aligned, the stance of someone who belonged exactly where he was standing. The saxophone seemed to grow larger in his hands, or perhaps he was growing to meet its demands. The tentative boy who'd been cowering in the corner was disappearing, replaced by something else entirely. A musician, an artist, a force that commanded attention through talent rather than wealth. The ballroom's acoustics embraced the music like they'd been waiting for it. Sound bounced off marble and crystal, creating a resonance that wrapped around every listener. The room itself seemed to be participating in the performance, enhancing every note, amplifying every nuance. Guests who'd been checking their phones found themselves lowering the devices. Servers who'd been trying to work discreetly stopped mid-step. Even the bartenders in the corner had paused their glass polishing to listen. The entire ballroom was being drawn into something they hadn't expected, genuine art in a place designed for shallow display. Carmen recognized the change in her son's posture. She'd seen it before, during those cold evenings on the fire escape when Damon transcended their circumstances and touched something larger than their small world. But this was different. This was her son claiming space in a room designed to exclude him, transforming it through the power of his gift. The melody climbed and descended with emotional precision that belonged to musicians 3 times Damon's age. His fingers moved across the keys with impossible fluency, finding the spaces between notes where the real music lived. Each phrase built on the last, creating an architecture of sound that told a story without words. This wasn't just technical proficiency, it was storytelling through sound, prayer through melody, resistance through beauty. Every note was placed with intentionality that spoke to years of disciplined practice and natural understanding that couldn't be taught or bought. A tech executive near the back found himself remembering his grandmother's stories about the Jim Crow South. A philanthropist who'd never questioned her assumptions about deserving poverty felt something crack open in her chest. A hedge fund manager stopped calculating deals and started calculating the cost of his indifference. Margaret Carter was no longer just listening. She was analyzing with professional precision. The boy's embouchure was textbook perfect. His breath control was extraordinary for someone his age. His musical phrasing showed an understanding of the song's emotional landscape that should have taken decades to develop. But more than technical skill, she recognized something rarer: musical intelligence. The ability to hear not just notes but the spaces between them. To understand that music was conversation, not performance. To know that the audience wasn't separate from the art, they were part of it. Richard Blackstone's confident expression was crumbling in real time. His mouth had fallen slightly open, his arms uncrossed. His phone buzzed insistently with stock alerts, the digital heartbeat of his empire. But for the first time in years, he didn't check it. The music had bypassed his intellectual defenses and spoken directly to whatever remained of his humanity. Halfway through the piece, Damon reached the song's most challenging passage, a soaring, mournful phrase that had broken veteran musicians. The notes climbed higher, demanding perfect pitch control and breath support that seemed impossible from someone so young. The room held its breath. For one terrifying moment, the music seemed to hang in the balance. This was the moment Richard had been waiting for. The inevitable failure. The proof that talent without privilege was just delusion waiting to be exposed. Then Damon soared. The saxophone sang with a voice that seemed too large for the boy controlling it. The melody climbed with aching beauty, each note placed with surgical precision, each phrase building on the last until the music became something alive and breathing in the space between performer and audience. The sound filled every corner of the ballroom, bouncing off crystal and marble to create harmonics that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Damon's tone was pure, mature, carrying emotional weight that spoke to experiences far beyond his 12 years on Earth. Around the ballroom, the transformation was spreading like ripples in still water. A venture capitalist who'd abandoned violin lessons 40 years ago felt tears on his cheeks, remembering the music teacher who'd believed in him before ambition killed his dreams. A society matron thought about her housekeeper's daughter, suddenly seeing her with new eyes. A tech CEO found himself thinking about the janitor whose name he'd never learned, wondering what dreams moved behind those tired eyes. Vivian Blackstone watched her husband's face change, seeing something she hadn't witnessed in years: vulnerability. The man who controlled algorithms that could identify anyone, anywhere, was failing to recognize the boy standing 20 feet away. The child he'd tried to humiliate was teaching him something about power that his billions had never bought. As Damon entered the song's final movement, his saxophone seemed to channel voices beyond his own. Every silenced dreamer, every overlooked talent, every person who'd been told they didn't belong in rooms like this. The music built to a crescendo that didn't just fill the ballroom, it transformed it into something sacred. The chandelier crystals seemed to vibrate in sympathy with the sound. Champagne glasses sat forgotten on silver trays. The very air in the room felt different, charged with the electricity of witnessing something that shouldn't have been possible but was happening anyway. When Damon played the final note, a long, sustained tone that seemed to hang in the air like a challenge, like a promise, like a prayer answered, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was pregnant with possibility, heavy with the weight of shifted perspectives, thick with the recognition that everything had changed. The last note faded into a silence so complete that the ballroom seemed to have stopped breathing. 300 people stood frozen, processing what they'd witnessed, understanding that they'd experienced something that would change how they saw the world. Then came the sound that would haunt Richard Blackstone's nightmares for years to come. Applause. Not polite charity gala clapping. This was a thunderous, overwhelming ovation that seemed to shake the crystal chandeliers themselves. 300 people rose to their feet as one, their hands coming together in recognition of something they'd never expected to witness. Some guests were crying openly. A venture capitalist wiped tears from his cheeks without shame. Even the servers had stopped pretending to work, joining the standing ovation with genuine enthusiasm. Margaret Carter was the first to find her voice. In 30 years of professional music, I have rarely heard such mature artistry from someone so young. Her words carried weight. This wasn't empty praise. This was the principal violinist of the New York Philharmonic, someone who knew the difference between talent and genius. Other voices joined hers. A Grammy-winning producer. Extraordinary. A Juilliard board member. We need to talk to this young man immediately. But all eyes gradually turned toward Richard Blackstone, the man who'd orchestrated this moment as entertainment and found himself witnessing his own destruction instead. Richard stood frozen in the center of the marble floor, his predatory smile completely erased. His mouth hung slightly open, his arms dangling uselessly. The man who'd controlled every conversation, commanded every room, dominated every situation, looked utterly lost. His wife, Vivian, stared at him with disgust that could no longer be hidden. His assistant held up the buzzing phone, but Richard didn't notice. His bodyguards exchanged uncomfortable glances, uncertain about their role. The phones that had emerged to capture a child's humiliation were now recording something entirely different. Videos were already uploaded with captions like, "Watch, kid destroys billionaire with one song, and this is what talent actually looks like." Patricia, Carmen's supervisor, was no longer scowling. Instead, she was approaching Carmen with something resembling respect. Other staff members looked at the mother and son with new eyes. But the most powerful moment belonged to Damon himself. He carefully placed his father's saxophone back in its worn case, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The applause continued around him, but he seemed to exist in a pocket of calm. When he finally looked up, his gaze found Richard Blackstone across the room. For a moment, the billionaire and the 12-year-old boy simply stared at each other. One who'd had everything handed to him, one who'd earned everything through dedication. One whose power came from money, one whose power came from truth. Then Damon spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly across the ballroom. Music doesn't know how much money your parents have, sir. It just knows if you're willing to listen. The words hit Richard like physical blows, simple, elegant, devastating in their accuracy. Around the ballroom, guests nodded in recognition of wisdom that seemed impossible from someone so young. Richard's face cycled through emotions, confusion, anger, something that might have been shame. He opened his mouth to respond, to reassert his dominance, to remind everyone who held the real power. But no words came. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Blackstone had nothing to say. The power structure had completely inverted. The man who'd entered as king now stood exposed as the small, cruel person he'd always been. The boy who'd entered as invisible help now commanded the respect of 300 influential strangers. Margaret Carter was already approaching Damon, her business card in hand. Other opportunities were crystallizing: recording contracts, scholarship offers, performance invitations. The very people who minutes ago had seen him as entertainment now recognized him as exceptional, and somewhere in the crowd, phones were still recording. The moment was becoming permanent, viral, undeniable. Richard Blackstone's cruelty would follow him far beyond this evening, but so would Damon Williams's triumph. The boy had played one song and changed everything. What happened next transformed the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom from a display of wealth into something resembling a job fair for genius. Margaret Carter reached Damon first, her business card already in hand. "I'm the principal violinist with the New York Philharmonic," she said, kneeling to meet his eyes. "We have a youth conservatory program, full scholarship. Are you interested?" Before Damon could answer, a Grammy-winning producer materialized beside them. "I'd like to discuss recording opportunities. That performance needs to be heard by the world." Then came the avalanche. 3 private music teachers volunteered their services, a wealthy widow offering to sponsor his education, the director of Lincoln Center's youth programs, a talent agent whose client list read like a who's who of classical music. Carmen stood against her marble pillar, watching her son's life change in real time. Her hands still trembled from adrenaline, but now it was excitement rather than terror. Patricia, her supervisor, approached with an expression Carmen had never seen before: respect. "I had no idea," Patricia whispered, "about your son's gift. We host cultural events throughout the year. Would you be interested in coordinating them? You clearly understand real talent." Carmen's expertise, her knowledge of music, her ability to recognize artistic excellence was suddenly valuable instead of irrelevant. The woman who'd spent years invisible in service uniforms was being seen for who she really was. But the most interesting conversation was happening across the ballroom. Richard Blackstone stood isolated in a circle of his own making. His entourage had quietly dispersed, sensing the shift in social dynamics. Guests who'd laughed at his cruel jokes now avoided eye contact. The man who'd commanded the room through fear and wealth was experiencing something foreign: consequences. Marcus Carter, his assistant, held up the phone with growing urgency. "Sir, the stock price is dropping. The video is already viral. Listen first is trending worldwide." Richard took the phone with numb fingers, scrolling through comments that grew more damning by the minute. The footage was crystal clear: his cruelty, his arrogance, contrasted with a child's dignity and extraordinary talent. The internet had already rendered its verdict. "Sir," Marcus's voice was strained, "Goldman Sachs is calling. They're concerned about the optics. The Robertson Foundation just pulled out of the AI contract." For the first time in decades, Richard Blackstone was learning that money couldn't fix everything. Some damage couldn't be bought, spun, or silenced. Some truths were too powerful to suppress. Vivian approached him slowly, her face a mask of cold determination. "I'm filing for divorce tomorrow," she said quietly. "Tonight was the final straw." I won't be married to a man who tortures children for entertainment. She removed her wedding ring, a 5-carat diamond worth more than most people's houses, and placed it on a nearby table. 20 years, Richard. 20 years I've watched you become this person. I'm done watching. She walked away without looking back, leaving Richard truly alone for the first time since he'd built his empire. Meanwhile, across the ballroom, Margaret Carter was explaining the Manhattan Youth Conservatory to Damon. It's a preparatory program for serious young musicians. Full scholarship includes private lessons, ensemble work, theory classes. When you're ready, maybe at 14 or 15, we'll help you audition for Juilliard pre-college. Damon's eyes widened. Juilliard. The word his mother whispered like a prayer. The dream his father had carried through war zones, the possibility that had seemed as distant as stars. The program starts in January, Margaret continued. Are you interested? Damon looked across the ballroom at his mother, who was listening to Patricia describe opportunities she'd never imagined. He thought about their apartment in Queens, about practicing on fire escapes, about dreams that had seemed impossible 3 hours ago. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. I'm very interested. But the most unexpected moment came when Richard Blackstone approached them. The billionaire looked aged, diminished, uncertain. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by something that might have been humility. He began, then stopped. The man whose voice had commanded boardrooms and conferences found himself struggling with simple words. I was wrong. About everything. About your son, about you, about... He gestured helplessly at the ballroom around them. Carmen studied him with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to trust powerful men bearing apologies. What exactly are you saying, Mr. Blackstone? I'm saying I'd like to make this right. Your son is extraordinary. He deserves every opportunity. Let me... Richard paused, seeming to wrestle with unfamiliar concepts like humility and genuine remorse. Let me help. Not for publicity or tax write-offs, because it's right. Carmen's response surprised everyone, including herself. The only thing my son needs from you is the respect you should show every person in this room, including your servers. The words hung in the air like a challenge, like a lesson, like a promise that the old rules no longer applied. 6 months later, Damon thrived at the Manhattan Youth Conservatory. Carmen had launched her own cultural events business, finally using her knowledge and expertise professionally. They'd moved to a better apartment, but Damon still practiced on the fire escape, now by choice, not necessity. And Richard Blackstone? He was learning to listen. 1 year later, the Plaza Hotel hosted another charity gala. But this time, Damon Williams wasn't hiding in the corner. He was the featured performer. The same marble floors, the same crystal chandeliers, the same wealthy crowd. But everything had changed. Damon walked onto the stage wearing a concert tuxedo, carrying his father's saxophone with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where he was standing. In the front row sat Carmen, no longer invisible in a server's uniform, but honored as the parent of the evening's star performer. Margaret Carter applauded from the VIP section. Recording industry executives took notes for future collaborations. And in the back, almost unnoticed, sat Richard Blackstone. Alone. He'd lost his empire, his wife, his social standing. But he'd gained something more valuable, the ability to recognize beauty instead of just consuming it. That night a year ago, Richard had tried to break a child's spirit and ended up shattering his own illusions. The viral video had cost him billions, but it had taught him what money couldn't buy, respect earned through character rather than commanded through fear. Now he quietly funded music programs in underserved schools. No publicity, no tax benefits, just the simple act of opening doors he'd once helped keep closed. As Damon began to play, a soaring jazz piece that filled the ballroom with hope, Richard found himself wiping away tears. The boy had shown him that talent doesn't wear expensive clothes or arrive in luxury cars. It lives in worn saxophone cases and practices on fire escapes. It speaks through calloused fingers and dreams deferred but never abandoned. Today, Damon Williams is a sophomore at Juilliard, his father's dream realized through his own determination and his mother's unwavering support. He still carries his father's saxophone case, but now it travels to concert halls across the country. Every day, in every workplace, school, and community, there are people whose talents remain hidden behind assumptions about what success looks like. How many brilliant minds do we overlook because they don't fit our narrow definition of potential? Have you ever been that person, dismissed before anyone heard your story? Or have you been the one doing the dismissing, judging potential by appearances? What would change if we listened first and assumed second? If Damon's story moved you, there are thousands more like him waiting for someone to believe in their dreams. Subscribe to hear more stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Hit that notification bell, because next week we're sharing the story of a homeless veteran whose chess game in Central Park caught the attention of a world champion. This is just the beginning. Every Tuesday, we bring you real stories of underdogs who prove that talent, character, and determination can triumph over prejudice and privilege. Because sometimes, the most powerful moments happen when the underestimated get their chance to soar. And if you think Damon's performance was impressive, wait until you hear what happened when that chess master realized his opponent wasn't just homeless. He was a former MIT professor whose life took an unexpected turn. That story will challenge everything you think you know about success and failure.